Hello guys, welcome to another book recommendation, and today we're going to take a look at When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. This book was written by Paul, and he was a neurosurgeon, and he died at age 37 of incurable lung cancer. So this book describes Paul's life and how he became a medical student, and a little bit about his family, and also about the life at the hospital, being a promising neurosurgeon, and then all of a sudden being diagnosed with cancer, and how he transitioned into being a patient. So let me just read Paul Kalanthi's bio. He was a neurosurgeon and writer. He held degrees in English literature, human biology, and history and philosophy of science and medicine from Stanford and Cambridge universities before graduating from Yale School of Medicine. He also received the American Academy of Neurological Surgery's highest award for research. His reflections on doctoring and illness have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Paris Review Daily. Kalanithi died in March 2015, aged 37. He is survived by his wife Lucy and their daughter Elizabeth Arcadia. And this is him, right there in his neurosurgeon scrubs, before he died. So I asked myself, why is it I want to read a book that I know will make me sad and it's tragic? And I think that his wife, after he died in the epilogue here, writes pretty well why that is. Let me just read that. He wanted to help people understand death and face their mortality. Dying in one's fourth decade is unusual now, but dying is not. The thing about lung cancer is that it's not exotic. Paul wrote in an email to his best friend Robin, "It's just tragic enough and just imaginable enough. The reader can get into these shoes, walk a bit and say, so that's what it looks like from here. Sooner or later I'll be back here in my own shoes." That's what I'm aiming for, I think. Not the sensationalism of dying and not exhortations to gather rosebuds. But here's what lies up ahead on the road. Of course he did more than just describe the terrain, he traversed it bravely. I'm curious. I want to know what it's like from a safe distance. And also what thoughts go through his head, this brilliant young man of 36 when he got that diagnosis. What does he decide to do with the remainder of his life when he knows it'll be so short moving forward? How do you cope with that? And also knowing that it could happen to me, or it could happen to anyone. It could happen now or in old age. You might be there in those shoes. And that makes it fascinating. So the very first paragraphs of the book are these. I flipped through the CT scan images, the diagnosis obvious, the lungs were matted with innumerable tumors, the spine deformed, a full lobe of the liver obliterated, cancer widely disseminated. I was a neurosurgical resident entering my final year of training. Over the last 6 years, I had examined scores of such scans, on the off chance that some procedure might benefit the patient, but this scan was different. It was my own. And that's a very strong opening. That really sets the stage of the book. I'm just going to be reading a lot out loud because I have a lot of passages in here that I think are very good and will let you know what the book is all about. So if you want to pick it up yourself, you'll have a better idea of what to expect. So let's just move on to the next passage. And this was his outlook before he was diagnosed. At age 36, I had reached the mountaintop. I could see the promised land from Gilead to Jericho to the Mediterranean Sea. I could see a nice catamaran on that sea that Lucy, our hypothetical children, and I would take out on weekends. I could see the tension in my back unwinding as my work schedule eased and life became more manageable. I could see myself finally becoming the husband I had promised to be. So he felt he was almost there at the turning point in his career where he would move from being a resident to a professor of medicine and should reap the rewards of what he had been sowing his entire life. And the next passage I'll read is when he's being hospitalized. I received the plastic arm bracelet all patients wear, put on the familiar light blue hospital gown, walked past the nurses I knew by name, and was checked into a room, the same room where I had seen hundreds of patients over the years. In this room I had sat with patients and explained terminal diagnosis and complex operations. In this room I had congratulated patients on being cured of a disease, and seen their happiness at being returned to their lives. In this room I had pronounced patients dead. I had sat in the chairs, washed my hands in the sink, scrawled instructions on the marker board, changed the calendar. I had even in moments of utter exhaustion longed to lie down in this bed and sleep. Now I lay there wide awake. A young nurse, one I hadn't met, poked her head in. The doctor will be in soon, and with that, the future I had imagined, the one just about to be realized, the culmination of decades of striving, evaporated. And that's the end of the prologue. And then comes an account of where we see a little bit of his childhood, but also a lot about being in a medical school and choosing medicine over literature and why he did that. And he really is not sugarcoating anything. His description of medical school and being a young doctor and a neurosurgeon is very visceral and an honest account. He's not trying to sell you anything. So I think it would be great for anyone thinking about going into medicine to actually read this book, because it will tell you exactly what you can expect and also what's good about it and what will really take a toll on you, a heavy toll. So here's a passage recounting from his childhood that they had just moved to, I think it was Austin, Texas, and his mom is worried that the school system there is not good enough. So she gets a prep list for college and she puts him through the entire reading list at age 10. His mom is an immigrant from India who married his dad, who is also a doctor, and moved to the United States. So I guess they also have tiger moms in India, not just in China. Endless books and authors followed as we worked our way methodically down the list. The Count of Monte Cristo, Edgar Allan Poe, Robinson Crusoe, Ivanhoe, Gogol, The Last of the Mohicans, Dickens, Twain, Austen, Billy Budd. By the time I was 12, I was picking them out myself, and my brother Suman was sending me the books he had read in college. The Prince, Don Quixote, Candide, Le Morte, D'Arthur, Beowulf, Thoreau, Sartre, Camus. Some left more of a mark than others. Brave New World founded my nascent moral philosophy and became the subject of my college admissions essay, in which I argued that happiness was not the point of life. And now thinking about how his life ended, that has some connotations to it. Hamlet bore me 1,000 times through the usual adolescent crisis. To his coy mistress and other romantic poems led me and my friends on various joyful misadventures throughout high school. We often sneaked out at night too, for example sing American Pie beneath the window of the captain of the cheerleading team. Her father was a local minister, and so we reasoned less likely to shoot. So we can see how that might have fostered a literary interest in his early childhood. So here's another passage where he's trying to figure out whether or not he wants to pursue medicine or literature. A few years later, I hadn't thought much more about a career, but had nearly completed degrees in English literature and human biology. I was driven less by achievement than by trying to understand in earnest what makes human life meaningful. I still felt literature provided the best account of the life of the mind, while neuroscience laid down the most elegant rules of the brain. Meaning, while a slippery concept, seemed extricable from human relationships and moral values. And he is expanding on this in a paragraph just a little bit down. Throughout college, my monastic scholarly study of human meaning would conflict with my urge to forge and strengthen the human relationships that formed the meaning. If the unexamined life was not worth living, was the unlived life worth examining? And that's sort of a riff on a famous saying of Socrates that the unexamined life is not worth living. And here Paul turns that on its head and asks if sitting with your head in the books all day is not really providing you with the meaning of life, which is relationships and experiences. Is it worth examining that life? And this is sort of a thread through his book, that he finds the meaning of life in relationships and the interaction and communication with other human beings through language and our brain. And here's a passage where Paul is in med school, I think, and they're visiting a home where people with brain damage are treated. At first, the guide explained, a family will visit constantly, daily, or even twice a day, then maybe every other day, then just weekends. After months or years, the visits taper off until it's just, say, birthdays and Christmas. Eventually, most families move away as far as they can get. I don't blame them, she said. It's hard caring for these kids. A fury churned in me. Hard? Of course it was hard. But how could parents abandon these kids? So they just described there how the visits taper off from the family. But then he talks and this is during the same visit with a professor. The professor was a mentor, someone who thought deeply about how science and morality intersected. I expected him to agree with me. Yeah, he said, good for you, but sometimes, I think it's better if they die. I grabbed my bag and left. She had been smiling, hadn't she? Only later would I realize that our trip had added a new dimension to my understanding of the fact that brains give rise to our ability to form relationships and make life meaningful. Sometimes they break. So what he's commenting on here is also, I think, the seed of the understanding of that maybe life is not always worth living if your brain is damaged or your quality of life is extremely low. And you will sometimes meet really old people that will say that they actually don't hope that they'll be around in 10 years because the days are filled with more and more pain and they're more tired. So maybe there are some instances where it is better to not try and save a life. But that's a moral question and obviously something very subjective. So here's a passage where he describes why he went into medicine instead of literature. But I couldn't quite let go of the question, where did biology, morality, literature and philosophy intersect? And it does that in the brain. And that's why he picked it. And here's a description when he entered medical school. And one of the rites of passage in medical school is a cadaver dissection. And he writes very vividly. You would think that the first time you cut up a dead person, you'd feel a bit funny about it. Strangely though, everything feels normal. The bright lights, stainless steel tables and bow-tied professors lend an air of propriety. Even so, that first cut, running from the nape of the neck down to the small of the back, is unforgettable. The scalpel is so sharp it doesn't so much cut the skin as unzip it, revealing the hidden and forbidden sinew beneath, and despite your preparation you are caught unawares, ashamed and excited. Cadaver dissection is a medical rite of passage and a trespass on the sacrosanct, engendering a legion of feelings, from revulsion, exhilaration, nausea, frustration and awe, to, as time passes, the mere tedium of academic exercise. Everything teeters between pathos and bathos. Here you are, violating society's most fundamental taboos, and yet formaldehyde is a powerful appetite stimulant, so you also crave a burrito. Cadavers reverse the polarity. The mannequins you pretend are real, the cadavers you pretend are fake. And that's a very vivid account of that. And here's another passage I think is great. It's very poetic, really. And he's describing how hard it is when he was working as a neurosurgeon and working incredible hours. A very tough job, really. And he was always working, always at the hospital, and always surrounded by death and grief. And this is the passage. At moments, the weight of it all became palpable. It was in the air, the stress and misery. Normally you breathed it in without noticing it. But some days, like a humid muggy day, it had a suffocating weight of its own. Some days this is how it felt when I was in the hospital, trapped in an endless jungle summer, wet with sweat, the rain of tears of the families of the dying pouring down. That's almost poetic, even though of course it is also sad. And here's a description of an actual brain surgery, and it's very visceral and certainly not sugar-coated. And this is an operation that he performed himself on a patient. When tumors or malformations abut these language areas, the surgeon takes numerous precautions, ordering a host of different scans, a detailed neuropsychological examination. Critically, however, the surgery is performed with the patient awake and talking. And I had no idea that you would perform brain surgery while the patient was awake and talking. Once the brain is exposed, but before the tumor excision, the surgeon uses a handheld ball-tip electrode to deliver electrical current to stun a small area of the cortex while the patient performs various verbal tasks, naming objects, reciting the alphabet, and so on. When the electrode sends current into a critical piece of cortex, it disrupts the patient's speech. The brain and the tumor are thus mapped to determine what can be resected safely, and the patient is kept awake throughout, occupied with a combination of formal verbal tasks and small talk. And this is also a pretty good example of how the book really does not sugarcoat anything. You feel like you're almost there with him, going through all of these things, from adversity to surgery to everything else. And here's a passage on doctors' responsibility. I guess they could just exchanged the Hippocratic Oath for this passage. Doctors in highly charged fields met patients at inflected moments, the most authentic moments where life and identity were under threat. The duty included learning what made that particular patient's life worth living and planning to save those things if possible, or to allow the peace of death if not. Such power required deep responsibility, sharing in guilt and recrimination. So here again, doctor's responsibility in determining what can be saved and if it should be saved at all, or if you should just let the patient die. A moral question that, again, is very subjective, but can become very practical if you have someone who ends up in that situation. So here's another passage, and here he has been diagnosed with cancer, and he feels lost. One chapter of my life seemed to have ended. Perhaps the whole book was closing. Instead of being the pastoral figure aiding a life transition, I found myself the sheep, lost and confused. Severe illness wasn't life-altering. It was life-shattering. It felt less like an epiphany, a piercing burst of light illuminating what really matters, and more like someone had just firebombed the path forward. Now I would have to work around it. And here he's talking about that he had to sort of reinvent his new identity. You know, was he still a neurosurgeon? Was he still the Paul that everybody used to know? Or was he now a patient? Or was he now someone who could do not what he could before, but something else? And here he reflects on his new situation. I began to realize that coming in such close contact with my own mortality had changed both nothing and everything. Before my cancer was diagnosed, I knew that someday I would die, but I didn't know when. After the diagnosis, I knew that someday I would die, but I didn't know when. But now I knew it acutely. The problem wasn't really a scientific one. The fact of death is unsettling, yet there is no other way to live. So he knew exactly the same before the diagnosis, that he would eventually die, but he did not know when. And that is the same that he knew after the diagnosis. And that's a very interesting observation, I think. So here's how he felt about statistics after the diagnosis. It occurred to me that my relationship with statistics changed as soon as I became one. What patients seek is not scientific knowledge that doctors hide, but existential authenticity each person must find on her own. Getting too deeply into statistics is like trying to quench a thirst with salty water. The angst of facing mortality has no remedy in probability. So it doesn't really help to know what your statistics are of survival in 1, 2, 3 or 4 years. I think that's what he's saying there. You have to come to grips with it in other ways. So after Paul was diagnosed with cancer, he and his wife decided to have a child. And you might think that that's odd, or you might choose differently if that was you. But he has a very good passage here describing exactly why it was that they chose that. I knew a child would bring joy to the whole family, and I couldn't bear to picture Lucy, husbandless and childless after I died, but I was adamant that the decision ultimately be hers. She would likely have to raise the child on her own, after all, and to care for both of us as my illness progressed. Will having a newborn distract from the time we have together, she asked. Don't you think saying goodbye to your child will make your death more painful? Wouldn't it be great if it did, I said. Lucy and I both felt that life wasn't about avoiding suffering. Years ago it occurred to me that Darwin and Nietzsche agreed on one thing: the defining characteristic of the organism is striving. Describing life otherwise was like painting a tiger without stripes. After so many years of living with death, I had come to understand that the easiest death wasn't necessarily the best. We talked it over. Our families gave the blessing. We decided to have a child. We would carry on living instead of dying. So that's the decision that they came to and how they arrived at it. So here's a passage describing how he sort of tried to come to grips with his new situation and mortality and perhaps imminent death. Lost in a featureless wasteland of my own mortality and finding no traction in the realms of scientific studies, intracellular molecular pathways and endless curves of survival statistics, I began reading literature again. Soletjin's Cancer Ward, B.S. Johnson's The Unfortunates, Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich, Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, Woolf, Kafka, Montaigne, Frost, Greville, memoirs of cancer patients, anything by anyone who had ever written about mortality. I was searching for a vocabulary with which to make sense of death, to find a way to begin defining myself and inching forward again. The privilege of direct experience had led me away from literary and academic work, yet now I felt that to understand my own direct experiences, I would have to translate them back into language. Hemingway described this process in similar terms, acquiring rich experiences, then retreating to cogitate and write about them. I needed words to go forward, and so it was literature that brought me back to life during this time. The monolithic uncertainty of my future was deadening. Everywhere I turned, the shadow of death obscured the meaning of any action. So in this hard time, he turns back to literature and other people's experiences as they had written them down, as well as poetry. And here's another very strong passage where he discovers that he's actually gone through the 5 stages of grief, but in reverse order, starting with acceptance and going through depression, bargaining, anger, and then in the end denial, which is the opposite way of the theory that states that you go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And the passage is this. It struck me that I had traversed the 5 stages of grief, the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, cliché, but I had done it all backward. On diagnosis, I had been prepared for death. I had even felt good about it. I had accepted it. I had been ready. Then I slumped into a depression as it became clear that I might not be dying so soon after all, which is of course good news, but also confusing and strangely enervating. The rapidity of the cancer science and the nature of the statistics meant I might live another 12 months or another 120. Grand illnesses are supposed to be life-clarifying. Instead, I knew I was going to die, but I had known that before. My state of knowledge was the same, but my ability to make lunch plans had been shot to hell. The way forward would seem obvious if only I knew how many months or years I had left. Tell me 3 months, I'd spend time with family. Tell me 1 year, I'd write a book. Give me 10 years, I'd get back to treating diseases. The truth that you live one day at a time didn't help. What was I supposed to do with that day? At some point then I began to do a little bargaining. Then after the bargaining came flashes of anger. I worked my whole life to get to this point, and then you give me cancer. And now finally, maybe I had arrived at denial, maybe total denial, maybe in the absence of any certainty, we should just assume that we are going to live a long time. Maybe that's the way, the only way forward. So here he also describes that it's very hard to figure out what to do with your life in the face of your own mortality when you don't know how long time you actually have left. What do you do with the day? What should you do with the time that you have left? In the beginning, when it looked like the cancer was perhaps retreating, he went back to performing neurosurgery. And when that became too hard for him, he went back to writing. And here's a passage where he discovers that the cancer is coming back. I rolled back the images, looked again. There it was, a new tumor, large, filling my right middle lobe. It looked oddly like a full moon, having almost cleared the horizon. Going back to the old images, I could make out the faintest trace of it, a ghostly harbinger now brought fully into the world. I was neither angry nor scared, it simply was. It was a fact about the world, like the distance from the sun to the earth. So that's almost a poetic description of the cancer recurring. So now he's back in the patient's clothes. Once again, I had traversed the line from doctor to patient, from actor to acted upon, from subject to direct object. My life up until my illness could be understood as the linear sum of my choices. As in most modern narratives, a character's fate depended on human actions, his and others. King Lear's Gloucester may complain about human fate as flies to wanton boys, but it is Lear's vanity that sets in motion a dramatic arc of the play. From the Enlightenment onward, the individual occupied center stage, but now I lived in a different world, a more ancient one, where human action paled against superhuman forces, a world that was more Greek tragedy than Shakespeare. No amount of effort can help Oedipus and his parents escape their fates. So when we are not hit with stuff like this, we feel like we are the masters of our fate, that our life sums up to all of our actions. But now he felt like he was part of a Greek tragedy or the ancient world where fate was your master. You couldn't do anything about it. It was out of your hands. Sometimes stuff just happens. And here's another paragraph on time and his reflections on that. Time for me is now double-edged. Every day brings me further from the low of my last relapse, but closer to the next recurrence, and eventually death. Perhaps later than I think, but certainly sooner than I desire. There are, I imagine, two responses to that realization. The most obvious might be an impulse to frantic activity, to live life to its fullest, to travel, to dine, to achieve a host of neglected ambitions. Part of the cruelty of cancer, though, is not only that it limits your time, it also limits your energy, vastly reducing the amount you can squeeze into a day. It is a tired hare who now races. And even if I had the energy, I prefer a more tortoise-like approach. I plod, I ponder. Some days I simply persist. If time dilates when one moves at high speeds, does it contract when one moves barely at all? It must. The days have shortened considerably. So the cancer had stolen his time, but also his energy, and that makes it hard to really put something into those days. And the very last thing that is in this book that he wrote before he died, he did not actually finish the entire book before he died, but the last thing is a message to his daughter, and I'll read that now. Everyone succumbs to finitude. I suspect I am not the only one who reaches this perfect state. Most ambitions are either achieved or abandoned. Either way, they belong to the past. The future, instead of the ladder toward the goal of life, flattens out into a perpetual present. Money, status, all the vanities the preacher of Ecclesiastes described hold so little interest, are chasing after wind indeed. Yet one thing cannot be robbed of her future. Our daughter, Katie, I hope I'll live long enough that she has some memory of me. Words have a longevity, I do not. I had thought I could leave her a series of letters, but what would they say? I don't know what this girl will be like when she is 15. I don't even know if she'll have taken to the nickname we have given her. There is perhaps only one thing to say to this infant, who is all future, overlapping briefly with me, whose life, barring the improbable, is all but past. That message is simple. When you come to one of the many moments in life where you must give an account of yourself, provide a ledger of what you have been and done and meant to the world, do not, I pray, discount that you filled a dying man's days with a sated joy, a joy unknown to me in all my prior years, a joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests satisfied. In this time, right now, that is an enormous thing. So that was his message to his daughter. And I suspect that's probably also his main reason for writing the book, so that she would know something about him and what he went through and how much he loved her when she would eventually be old enough to read this book. Now the last passage I'll read of this book is from the Epilogue, which was written by his wife. When Paul emailed his best friend in May of 2013 to inform him that he had terminal cancer, he wrote, "The good news is I've already outlived 2 Brontes, Keats and Stephen Crane. The bad news is that I haven't written anything." But he did, and it's a very powerful book. When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, and the front cover there displays a man in neurosurgeon scrubs and patient clothes on the back. Pick up the book if you think it looks interesting. Let me know what you think of the book, if you already read it, or anything else that you might like to talk about in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.